Hi, my name is Brenda Mant, and I am a writer who focuses on women in aviation. I am here today to answer 7 questions about that very topic. Question 1. This question is from Passerby. Why is Amelia Earhart so famous? All she did was die. So, all that Amelia Earhart did was not die. That's just what she is most famous for and has kind of immortalized her for all time. She was especially accomplished at long distance flights. She became the first woman to cross the Atlantic as a passenger, and then she was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic solo. And she was also the first person to fly from Hawaii to the mainland United States solo. Her husband was involved with the media and spent a lot of time and resources promoting her and making her very popular. There were a lot of women pilots who were active in the 1920s and 1930s. Amelia is just the most famous of them. If you are interested in women pilots who did amazing things during this time period, I might recommend Helen Rishi or Ruth Nichols or Louise Thaden or Catherine Chung, all of whom are very interesting. Question 2. This question was submitted by Jimmy Neon. Did women fight on the front lines of World War II? Yes. Yes, they absolutely fought on the front lines in World War II in a variety of roles and in a variety of countries, although most not in an official capacity. There were women in the resistances all across Eurasia. However, the only country that allowed women formally into combat roles was the Soviet Union. Marina Raskova, who was a very famous pilot in the 1930s, she's been described as the Amelia Earhart of the Soviet Union, received thousands and thousands of letters from women all across the country who were interested in flying. One woman flew her airplane to the front and joined the fray that way. Yes, lots and lots of women on the front in World War II. Third question. Why were the WASP, that's Women Air Force Service Pilots, not considered military personnel during World War II? The Women Air Force Service Pilots was a group of women who were very accomplished pilots before they went through military-style training in Texas. And then after they finished training, they filled essential war jobs like towing targets for live ammunition practice. That was a really common position. And one WASP became a test pilot. When the war started, there wasn't really any infrastructure for women pilots to join the military. But very quickly, they were able to create women's auxiliaries. Which the first of those was the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, the WAAC, which was an auxiliary group, not technically part of the military, that was part of the US Army. And very shortly after its creation, the auxiliary section was dropped, and that group was formally militarized. Similarly, the Navy's WAVES, Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, the Navy's SPARS, Semper Paratus, Always Ready. Yes, they're researching on these acronyms, and the Marines, who didn't have a fancy acronym, were all originally created as women's auxiliaries that were formally part of the command structure of those branches of the military. The WASPs were kind of a different story. Most of these other groups, they are doing tasks that are more traditionally feminine. Secretarial work, analyzing documents, even code breaking was considered a more feminine job at the time than piloting an aircraft was. And the WASPs, they were considered a kind of experiment. They were kind of given this special status, but they were always intended to be militarized the same way that the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps had been. In 1944, they had been well proven to be highly successful at their jobs, and so they put the vote before Congress to become a formal part of the U.S. military. But the war was starting to wind down in Europe, and there was a small segment of male pilots who were concerned about possibly getting shipped overseas in not aviation roles and were interested in taking the essential war jobs that the WASPs were holding. They started a kind of a smear campaign in the press about the WASPs, and they got a congressperson on their side. This congressman wrote a report about how incompetent and expensive the WASP program was. And he wrote this report without speaking to any WASP or any person who commanded a WASP. And his report was extremely convincing. In the summer of 1944, the measure to militarize the WASPs officially became the first piece of legislation put forth by the U.S. military since Pearl Harbor to fail Congress. Question 4. This question was submitted by Burpee. Who was the first woman to fly? So this is a very interesting question, and it depends on what you mean by fly. The first woman to go up in an untethered balloon as a passenger was named Elisabeth de Tible. She was an opera singer in Paris, and this flight took place in 1784, about 6 months after the very first flight of a hot air balloon ever. She was dressed as Minerva, the goddess, for this flight and sang an aria from the balloon. And then she helped to feed the boiler. And the first woman to fly a balloon solo, also the first woman to pilot a balloon, was Geneviève Garnerin in 1799. She was also the first woman to parachute from a balloon. The first woman to operate a powered aircraft was named Ada de Acosta, and she was an American socialite who operated one of Alberto Santos Dumont's dirigibles in Paris in 1903. And all of those women did fly before the Wright brothers' first powered flight at Kitty Hawk. Question 5. This question was submitted by Arshem22. How have Black women advanced aviation? Well, Black women have done a lot to advance aviation. The first Black woman to earn a pilot's license in the world was also the first Native American woman to earn a pilot's license in the world, and her name was Bessie Coleman. She was living in Chicago, and she was trying to get a pilot's license because one of her brothers had teased her that French women could fly. And so she was going around and trying to find somebody who would teach her. And of all of the people who she asked, nobody was willing to teach her how to fly. And so she traveled to Paris and learned to fly in Paris. So her license was a Fédération Aéronautique Internationale license. And then she came back to the United States and was one of the only Black people who was flying in the United States at this time. And her big dream was to open up a flight school for Black Americans. She did lecture circuits and visited segregated schools, encouraged young Black children, especially Black girls, to pursue aviation. And unfortunately, she never saw her dream come true. She died in an aircraft accident in 1926. But just a few years later, in 1929, the first aviation school specifically for Black aviators opened in Los Angeles. And she directly inspired Willa Brown, who became the first Black woman to earn a pilot's license in the United States. She was living in Chicago. She joined the Challenger Aero Club. She was also a huge advocate for Black involvement in aviation, lobbying the US government for schools that taught Black pilots to be included in the civilian pilot training program in the lead up to World War II. And her advocacy was part of what gave the Tuskegee Institute's training program a boost. And ultimately, that program is what would be selected as the location for the Black fighter pilots in World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen. But prior to it being militarized, it was a civilian pilot training school location, and that never would have happened without Willa Brown's advocacy. When World War II broke out, she became the first Black officer in the Civil Air Patrol. After World War II was over, she took a break from aviation, but in the 1970s, she was on the Women's Advisory Board of the FAA as the FAA was starting to look at including women in commercial aviation. Sixth question. This question was submitted by Anxious Unto Death. I'm sorry. Why are flight attendants mostly women? When commercial aviation was just starting out, both women and men were stewards or stewardesses. Men were used primarily for this role in Europe, and some American airlines also were using primarily men. The first woman flight attendant was Ellen Church, a student pilot herself, and she was also a registered nurse. And she wanted to be a pilot. She got basically laughed out of the office in 1930, and then she came back with a contrary proposal. She would become a flight attendant. And her being a registered nurse was a pretty important part of it, because at this time, airplanes are flying mostly below the clouds. If you're flying under the clouds or flying in the clouds, it's very turbulent. Cabins are not pressurized. It's not a very comfortable experience. And so having a registered nurse on board was a pretty big asset. Eventually, it was decided by especially marketing groups for airlines that they shouldn't have men filling the steward role anymore. They would only have stewardesses or air hostesses who would basically be treating the passengers like honored guests in their homes or things like that. Like this was the kind of thinking. And there was also a lot of sexism that went into this decision, of course. Both the idea that most of the people flying were businessmen who wanted something pretty to look at, and also that women are naturally more gifted than men at being a caretaker, which is not true. The feminist movement of the 1970s was not just good for women. It pointed out that you could not have workplaces that were segregated based on gender or have gender preference in jobs. However, some of these associations of femininity with flight attendants have not gone away, and so we still have a profession that is dominated by women, even though there are men. Question 7. This question was submitted by Jody Costa. Why did Jackie Cochran testify against the Mercury 13? So, first, the Mercury 13 was an unsanctioned program that was put together by William Lovelace, the doctor, who did all of the tests for the Mercury 7, the first astronauts of the United States. He wanted to see how women would do on these tests, and he also thought that perhaps women would be better suited to space flight than men, or at least less expensive to launch, since they tend to be more petite and eat a little bit less than men. And therefore, you would have less weight in your capsule that you have to use rocket fuel to get to space. He identified 25 women, and they were going to go through 3 rounds of testing, the same 3 rounds of testing that the men of the Mercury 7 had gone through. And after the first round of testing, there were 13 women remaining, which is where the name Mercury 13 comes from. Jackie Cochran was an extremely accomplished pilot in the 1930s and 1940s. She was the commander of the Wasps. She won several prestigious air races. She, in the 1950s, became the first woman to break the sound barrier and the first woman to go twice the speed of sound. And she was able to achieve some of these things, like access to military supersonic aircraft, through the connections of her husband, who was very wealthy. She was one of the 12 women who did not pass the first round of tests. The government found out that William Lovelace was running these essentially illicit tests, financed by Jackie Cochran, and they put an end to that. They said that he couldn't do the second round of tests. And then the 13 women decided to sue the government for gender discrimination. It was undoubtedly gender discrimination, but it was also systemic gender discrimination. So it wasn't, you can't do this because you're a woman. It's, you can't do this because you're not a military test pilot. Women were not allowed to become military test pilots. But it wasn't because they were women that they were being turned down. It was because they didn't have this skills, this job that women couldn't get. And so their case was probably hopeless from the start. But it was extremely demoralizing when Jackie Cochran got on the stand before Congress and testified that there was no point in training women to become astronauts because they would just leave to have babies. Yeah, that was a pretty strong betrayal. Nobody can ever know what exactly she was thinking at that time. But there is a very distinct possibility that she felt some bitterness about not advancing to the second phase of tests. But we can never know exactly why. If you have any more questions about women in aviation, drop them in the comments. I just might do that. Ultimately, I hope that you have learned that women have been involved in a variety of roles in aviation since aviation began. Thank you.